Okay, we can start the session. And good evening to everyone. On behalf of Zomi Scholars Network and the Zoe Academia, I'm delighted to have you all here today to this discussion entitled Rethinking Syncretism, Conceptual Pathways in Indigenous Religious Contexts, which will be delivered by Dr. TIATEMSU Longkumer. Let me give a brief introduction to the speaker, and after that, I'll hand over the platform to him, followed by questions and answers and further discussions. Dr. TIATEMSU Longkumer is a senior lecturer in anthropology at Royal Thimphu College, Bhutan. He teaches courses in anthropological theory, the anthropology of religion, ethnographic writing, and contemporary issues in anthropology. His current research work includes Buddhism in Bhutan and the integration of generative AI in teaching and learning practices. He also published several of his works with reputed publishers and journals entitled The Naga Mind, Colonial Encounter and Religion. The next is Rethinking Ao Naga Traditional Religion. And recently, Mark's Dance in Bhutan, Unveiling Reality Through Mark's Kaleidoscope in the Journal of Center for Asian Studies, Mark Asia. And Dr. Tia is also often hosted for a new book in anthropology, right? New book in anthropology podcast that is dedicated for interviewing with anthropologists about their new books, which will be available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Over to you, Tia, if you are ready.
Yes. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. So, thank you for the wonderful opportunity. I think this kind of time is something which I really enjoy and which I really like doing. Um, today, what I want to do is actually bring in some ideas in that sense to really think about. I mean, not give solutions rather, but then some things that we can actually think about together in that sense, and which could be applied in our own context, in whichever area of research that we are doing in that sense. Obviously, for me, particularly, my research work was on Christianity and pre-Christian religion, that is animism in Nagaland. So, the way I kind of, studied and understood my conceptual way of trying to understand the context in that sense was from that lens in that sense. And obviously, today, um, as I'm here in Bhutan, I work on Buddhism in Bhutan, and this is one of the good privilege that I've had in life again to actually come here and work on Buddhism, something which is very different from again the religions that I've worked on. So, from all of this experience, we will try to kind of think about this topic together. So I wouldn't take a lot of time, but um, I mean, I'll try to unpack these things in 25 minutes or 30 minutes or so in that sense. So um, now, when I go back and look at how the area in the sense northeast India in the sense has been studied in this, when you look at this, then obviously we will find a lot of the so-called colonial administrators coming and writing about us, and you will also see that in this process, obviously, the so-called Christian missionaries have also come to our place, and they have actually also written a lot about us. But not only have they written a lot about us, but also they have had a lot of influence on our people in that sense, right? That is where obviously it shows a lot in terms of the religion that we follow today, also, right? That most of us in that sense call ourselves as Christians. And so, looking at it from this lens, one of the things that I thought about in terms of trying to, approach the religion, the context that I was working on was trying to understand, okay, when we think about our people, when we think about the religion that we have, the Christianity that we have, or so-called indigenous religion as such, one of the things that have had influenced us is Christianity in that sense. And obviously Christianity came from the Christian missionaries. Now, irrespective of whatever Christian missionaries have come to our place, because again, different, branches of Christian missionaries have come to our place. And so irrespective of that, one of the thing that I tried to think about was what was the kind of method or the methodology that they followed. And obviously, specifically when it comes to Nagaland, and since I work among the Ao Nagas of Nagaland, these were the so-called American Baptist missionaries. And I try to understand, okay, so what was this American Baptist missionaries' understanding or perspective of religion as a whole was, or so to say, Christianity was in that sense. And also I try to understand, okay, so in terms of them coming and trying to talk to our people about religion per se, right? Christianity per se. How did it do that in that sense? And so that was the initial question that I kind of asked in this. And one thing that I continued to see was that, when you talk about the kind of methodology or the method, and this is what I, discuss about in my work as, the missionary, the method in the sense during that time, right? And one of the thing that they believe in was this idea of, Sogol, this other lands in the sense, right? The land beyond the land, right? And one of the things that was very much popular during this time in America was this revival movement in that sense, right? And this American Baptist missionary, specifically in Nagaland, we talk about this person by the name E.W. Clark, right? And when we talk about E.W. Clark, he was also very much influenced by the so-called theology of that time in that sense, right? How do they understand evil? How do they understand faith in that sense? Right? Was very much influenced by that. And so the way they thought about this was obviously this aspect of evil as such, the land beyond their land was kind of, um, subjugated by the so-called evil spirits as such. And this is where we will also see writings where they will talk about, oh, when they were coming to the hills and all, they kind of sense some kind of evil spirit and all of those aspects that were there. But another thing that we will see them following is also that they didn't really have this idea or the so-called the notion of trying to understand cultures as such in that sense. Obviously, for them, they have had so-called, let's use the word, narrow idea of how they understood culture as such, because for them, if conversion have to be done, then conversion have to be done in terms of all kinds of beliefs and practices as such, right? And so this was something which was really interesting among the so-called missionaries and the missionary method that was there. But when we look specifically at E.W. Clark, and this is where the ethnographic aspect come into the picture, because we can talk a lot about theology, ideas, concepts, and all, but then in terms of contextually, how did E.W. Clark approach the people, right? Or approach the so-called native people whom they wanted to actually convert in that sense. And one of the things that we will see here in terms of their approach, their specific approach that you will see here is this aspect that E.W. Clark was not really concerned, when you look at this, E.W. Clark was not really concerned about what people were doing in terms of their practice as such. E.W. Clark was mostly concerned about, what people really believed in that sense, right? And that is one of the things that you will also see some kind of difference among the missionaries as such, because some missionaries were very much adamant in terms of, changing all kinds of practices as such, the so-called, native cultural practices as such. So that is one of the question or one of the first idea that I want to bring about in that sense, that, what is the missionary method in that sense, right? The method to convert people and to approach people. And when you look at how they converted and approach people, there was a certain kind of method that they followed. But when you look at it contextually as such, and specifically I look at the person called E.W. Clark, Dr. E.W. Clark, who came among the Ao Nagas, and he had a very different approach to how he understood, this aspect of conversion as such in that sense. For him, belief mattered a lot rather than this aspect of practice as such in that sense. But again, the other missionaries who came after him, they were not of the, same idea in the sense in terms of understanding conversion as such in the sense, right? The mission method in the sense. The first thing is that. Now, another thing that is very important here in terms of our context, right? In how we study religious context in terms of our religious belief and practices. When I was working on my PhD, one of the things that I continually came across was, and this was something which people pushed on my work, and people who were actually theologians, right? And because I was using this word animism a lot, and these theologians were coming and saying, "Oh, this animism, don't use this animism, the word animism anymore, because it has this, this colonial connotation, and animism is a very, narrow word. Why are you using this concept and idea?" And that was something which a word that I actually had to really explore, define, and understand as such. But another word that I used was this word called syncretism. Now, this was also a word which I got a lot of pushback on, again, from many scholars. And the pushback on the word syncretism came from people who are in obviously, the anthropology field and the field, or in my own field, right? Anthropology and sociology and all. And obviously, the other words, the other concept or a word that I really talked about, or I really tried to delve deep into, was this idea of religion as such. What does religion really mean in that sense, right? Because in our cultural context, we do not really have a word for religion. I mean, you go back to your own language that you use and try to find a word that coheres with the word religion as such. There's no word like that in any of our cultural contexts as such. And so I was trying to think about all of those things. And this is where, when we look at the word religion as such, let me first come to the word religion in that sense, right? When we come to the word religion as such, one thing that we will find is that across any cultures, community, or people as such, right, the word religion is an alien word, apart from the Judeo-Christian faith in the sense, right? Or apart from how Judeo-Christian faith used the word religion. Let me use that, right? Let me put that. Apart from how Judeo-Christian faith used the word religion in the sense. And when you come to Judeo-Christian faith, one of the things that you will see continually using in relation to religion is this idea of belief. Now, when you look at this word religion as such, when you see how this religion is being used, there's no context, or there's no people or community who use this word religion in relation to some kind of belief as such. It's only in the Judeo-Christian faith in the sense, or the Islam and all those people, they use this word. That's the first thing about religion in that sense. Another thing, as I've told you, is there's no word equivalent to religion in any of our contexts as such, right? And the third thing about religion in that sense is where, when you look at religion as such, right, it really very much is dependent on how we define it, right? How we define our parameters of when we are working on religion as such. And this is something which many of the people, and since I've read a lot of work on people from Nagaland in that sense, have actually missed this aspect. Because when many people use the word religion, they just use the word without defining its parameters in that sense. And this is where there are a lot of confusion that emerges in terms of trying to really understand what religion is in that sense, because people try to, what was the native word, what was, in our community, right? People used to say imse. Imse is the word that comes near to the word religion as such. Again, imse does not really talk about religion as such in our native language, but I think people use that because, again, there's no parameter, put up, or, there's no parameter that is there in terms of trying to define religion. This is where one of the very important confusion comes up in terms of trying to understand religion as such, right? And so the application of the word religion in a context in the sense should be really, we should be very careful in terms of trying to apply the word religion again, because again, the context itself is a very different thing, and also at the same time, we continually need to define the parameters. And this is one of the things that I continue to push back in terms of the scholarly work that is coming up, right? That has to do with religion. The second thing that I talk about was obviously this idea of animism in that sense, right? And I will not delve a lot on this idea of animism, but my argument always hinges on this aspect that all of the religion that we have, the pre-Christian religion that we have, comes under this so-called the animistic religion, right? And now this is something which you all can actually go back and read it, because I have written about this and my thesis is also available. This is where I try to kind of give a framework to trying to understand our pre-Christian religion as such, right? And this is something which you can actually take as a model and apply in your own context also in that sense, right? And so, but I do not, understand animism from the definitional aspect of E.B. Tyler, because E.B. Tyler has a definition of religion, but I do not really, my way of defining religion does not comes from E.B. Tyler's understanding of religion. But my way of defining, really, I mean, animism comes from people like Graham Harvey and all. If you know these people, Graham Harvey and all works a lot on this idea of, animism as such. Now, obviously, their idea of animism and all of those things are not that it's not very strong as such. There can be loopholes on that, but in my work, one thing I try to do is to actually work through all of that in that sense. And I argue for this thing that animism, in the sense, this word can be applied in our context in the sense. But obviously, we cannot really apply it, this aspect of copy pasting the concepts from the West and then apply it in our context. There's a way of applying this thing, which I actually talk about in my work in that sense, right? So that is another thing that I talk about. Now, the third thing, that is where I talk about syncretism. And this is where I want to push things a little bit further in that sense, right? I'm sure some of you might have heard the word syncretism. Some of you might not have heard the word syncretism in that sense. When you look at the word syncretism, the idea, the concept of syncretism as such, one of the things that you will actually see and understand is that, when you look at the history of the idea of syncretism as such, right? The idea of syncretism moved through different kind of phases, and the idea of syncretism was very much used in, obviously, many Christian theologians, the so-called Christian theologians, picked up on this word syncretism and has actually used this word a lot in that sense. But also at the same time, there were not only Christians, but other thinkers actually came and then used this word syncretism, right? And one of the unique characteristics of syncretism, syncretism is that, the word syncretism itself, in terms of its debate, in terms of its emergence, comes from religious debate, in that sense. A lot of the word syncretism has to do with, it was used in relation to debates about or discussion about religion in that sense, right? And this is where syncretism becomes an important aspect in religion. Now, one of the way by which people usually understand syncretism is obviously this aspect of, two religions coming together. How does two religions amalgamate together in that sense, right? Or how does different kinds of ideas amalgamate together in terms of this idea of syncretism as such? Syncretism as such, right? Now, I take a very different approach in terms of trying to understand syncretism rather than this aspect of amalgamation as such. I do not really take the approach of amalgamation as such. And this is where I want to kind of, talk about this a little bit, right? When I was working on the Ao Nagas and the religion and all, when I was reading a lot of the literatures by the people, one of the things that I continually see people doing was, people were continually referring to works by colonial administrators, and the people who were actually referring to works by colonial administrators were actually theologians. So these theologians were actually referring to works by colonial administrators, and they were actually expounding and writing about the so-called history and how conversion has happened and how pre-Christian religion, what kind of pre-Christian religion was there and how Christianity came, right? So these Christian theologians, the so-called, the Naga Christian theologians, were relying a lot on the works by colonial administrators. Now, one of the things that I saw, I realized from here is this, right? The framework by which they approach the pre-Christian religion, and this is where again I come to the understanding of defining, what religion is in that sense, right? The framework by which, these colonial administrators and also these people who were theologians approached the pre-Christian religion was from the framework of Christianity in that sense. So they were talking about God, let's so to say. They were trying to find this idea of God in pre-Christian religion. They were trying to find this idea of good spirit, bad spirit, and all of those things in the pre-Christian religion, right? And this is where one of the things that I continually saw was, this idea of redefining or this idea of Christianization of the so-called pre-Christian religion, right? So in my thesis, I use this word Christianization of our pre-Christian religion. I expound on this in the sense, on the process of Christianization and how this process of Christianization happened. And when I say Christianization, obviously I am talking about the approach by which they look at our pre-Christian religion, right? And the way they categorize it in that sense. And this is where I argue against. And you see any of the works by Nagas on pre-Christian religion, right? They are relying on the works by the colonial administrators and the theologians. And they are also copying and pasting this so-called the Christianization of understanding of this religion as such in that sense. This is something which is not unique to Nagaland. If you see, this is something which you will also see in your own context in the sense. Because again, more and more you will see that, the people who were initially being educated were people who were in the Christian fall in that sense, right? And so people who became Christians or converted Christians were actually the one who had the privilege to get educated again, a lot of Christian education in that sense, right? And because of that. And so this is where I continually argue for this aspect that we have to break away from this understanding of Christianization of understanding our pre-Christian religion. And one of the things that, this Christianization assumes is that, these native people, they actually kind of wholesale, accepted Christianity. When Christianity came, they were so amazed by Christianity. I mean, I'm just putting it in a crude way, but they were so amazed by Christianity and they kind of accepted Christianity as it is in that sense. But one of the way by which I talk about, Christianity and how people accepted Christianity is by actually giving voice to the people themselves, right? Because these people, right, and I've continually seen this, these native people who accepted Christianity, they didn't just accept Christian ideas, the beliefs or whatever, not. It was not so. They were actually accepting some of the aspects of Christianity for sure, yeah, that's true, but they were actually thinking it through in terms of what they are accepting, what they are not accepting, right? And how they are accepting in that sense. So, for example, even in our language, the one of the missionary, the E.W. Clark, he kind of used this word, right? To connote to Christian God, he used this word, the Ao Naga native word called Sangram, to connote to Christian God in that sense. Now, the way the Ao Christians understand Christians in the sense, the idea of God, right? If you see and talk to them, right? Many of them wouldn't really understand this idea of Trinity as such in that sense. The way they understand God in the sense, right? They are referring to Christian God when they use the word Zangram, because E.W. Clark has converted the word Zangram into God as such, right? To connote to Christian God. They're referring to Christian God, no doubt, but it does not really have the theological connotation of the so-called Christian God as such, if you really delve deep and try to think about that. And this is where one thing that is happening here is that the natives themselves are actually kind of rethinking and reinventing the Christian ideas as such. And this is something which is really important in our context as such, because people do not really give agency to the native people as such in terms of accepting this so-called religions as such, because people mostly think, Christianity came, we accepted it and we are living by it in that sense, right? And syncretism is the framework through which I actually kind of try to understand that in that sense, right? That there are creatively, creatively try to incorporate some kind of elements of their beliefs and practices as such in that sense. And so this is where when you push this aspects or idea a little bit further, right, in our context as such, or in the context that I come from in terms of trying to understand our the Christian religious beliefs and practices as such. One thing that I try to understand, or one thing that I try to push towards in terms of trying to understand syncretism is through the idea of conversion as such. Now, I'm sure you all might have thought about this as to how did we even convert to, how did our forefathers in the sense, right, convert to Christianity? What was the, factor by which it led them to convert in that sense? And what really happened? Were there some kind of changes in their kind of belief, or, suddenly there was some kind of changes in the practice and all? And I talk about many things about this idea of conversion as such, but one of the things that I talk about in terms of conversion is the idea of so-called conversion of pre-Christian, deities, or the pre-Christian so-called spirits as such. And in my work, I call these pre-Christian, deities or spirits as non-human beings as such. I use this word non-human beings to connote to these pre-Christian, deities as such. And one of the things that, many of our our Christians who converted in the sense believed was they also believed that when Christianity came, some of the so-called the pre-Christian spirits or the non-human, beings also actually converted to Christianity in that sense, right? And this is an interesting aspect of the idea of conversion and belief as such, because now, I mean, there are a lot of dynamics to this, but let me keep it simple. Because when you look at a village in the sense, right? See, now, village head plays a very important role in terms of gaining favor from spirits also in that sense, right? Because if you gain the favor of the village head, it's also believed that, okay, you gain some favor from the spirits. And obviously, in pre-Christian religion, there's a spirit, and they have believe in all kinds of spirits in that sense, right? The spirit of the village and different aspects of the spirits in that sense. And so you continually have to get the favor of the so-called spirits or non-human beings as such in that sense, right? And in order to continually get the favor of this, one of the things that you have to do is obviously that you need to please this so-called, pre-Christian spirits and all of those. And one thing that you will see is that people who actually converted, right, converted to Christianity in that sense, right, they also, as I've told you, they also believe that some of the spirit also converted. And this is where the idea of good and bad spirit also comes into the picture, because the idea is that good spirits are the one that actually converted to Christianity, bad spirits are the one that didn't convert as such in that sense. And this is how one of the way or dynamics of conversion happens in the sense of your relation to the pre-Christian. You convert in terms of your relation to the pre-Christian deities or spirit as such. Again, there are many other aspects, but I think one of the aspects of syncretism in that sense, right, is that aspect, right? Obviously, there's this aspect of land, there's this aspect of, infrastructure and all of those, but I think that is one of the important aspects. Another aspect that you will see in terms of this idea of syncretism is this idea of belief as such. Now, when you look at the word belief, right, see, among our people, in terms of our philosophy, right, our so-called indigenous philosophy as such, we do not really, in our philosophy, we do not really have this idea of belief as such. Our philosophy does not really expound this idea of belief as such. Now, when you talk about belief as such, belief has to do with this aspect of abstract idea of certainty as such. You're certain that, or in an abstract way, you are in a way certain that some thing, some being exists in that sense, right? And that is where in religions like Christianity, Islam, and all of those things, belief becomes a very important factor, because you have the belief, right, in an abstract philosophical way, that you have to believe that God exists in the sense, right? Or for example, in Christianity, you have to believe that, God, Jesus Christ died and rose. You have to believe in Trinity in that sense. Now, these are very abstract ideas and concepts as such, right? And something that which, if you ask any normal, ordinary Christian as such, he or she will not be able to expound as such. But then as long as he or she believes there's some kind of certainty to it, he or she becomes part of that religion as such. Now, this idea is something which is very alien to our pre-Christian, our indigenous philosophy as such, pre-Christian idea philosophy as such, the idea of belief as such. And this is where I bring in, through this concept or the idea of syncretism, I bring in this idea of the so-called disconnected belief, my idea of so-called disconnected belief in that sense. And this is where one of the things that you will see, right, among our people, the philosophy among the people, the indigenous people, is this idea of relationality in the sense, right? This idea of practicality and relationality. So we do not have idea of belief as such, we have this idea of relationality as such in the sense. So you believe in some kind of spirits, again, because you have formed some kind of relation to that kind of, deities or spirits as such in the sense, right? And now that, that bond or relation is formed through some kind of experiences as such, practical experiences as such. And this is where you will see continually, you will see a lot of stories relating to this in the sense, right, in our own indigenous beliefs and practices as such. Again, relationality and practicality is an important aspect, philosophy that comes up apart from this idea of belief as such, right? And so this is where, in terms of when you look at this idea of relationality as such, in that sense, right? See, the way I talk about disconnected belief is something like this, right? See, if you ask any Christians, right, any Christian, if you ask them, do you believe in God? They will say, yes, I believe in God. Do you believe in that, the idea of Trinity? Yes, they will say. So, I mean, everything that has to do with Christian in the sense, or Christianity as such in the sense, right? They will say they believe in it in the sense, right? So again, see, but then the way they express it again, right? There's this idea of belief as such, and there's an idea of expression as such, right? But the way they express it, there is some kind of disconnect to the idea of what I mean would actually will be believed in, Christian theology as such, as so-called theology. And I mean, I was lucky enough because I mean, during my college and master's time, I was very interested in Christian theology, and I've studied a lot of Christian theology, and that is how I could actually try to, understand and compare these aspects, right? And so, this is one of the things that you will see in terms of the idea of beliefs as such. Right? There's a certain kind of disconnect between this idea of theology as such, but also at the same time they continue to believe as such in that sense, right? But again, their belief emerges creatively in that sense. And that is how, I kind of talk about this idea of syncretism and this application of it. But I think one thing that you can continue to is, I mean, I would actually kind of point you all to my thesis because it's available in shortcut and you can actually download that. And I discuss this in length, right? All of these ideas very much in length. I just wanted to introduce some of these ideas and hopefully it has inspired all of you to at least look at these ideas further. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful and enlightening presentation, Shirley. Thank you. Yeah, one of the key takeaway from your presentation, I suppose, to my knowledge, is that there is an element of inversion evident in your studies, especially maybe about syncretism. That the idea that the colonized or the indigenous is not completely subjected, right, or ruled over entirely by the outsiders discourse, say Christian missionaries and so on. Because I have this hunch that generally the debate around indigenous studies often goes too much around being entirely over-determined, that often wrongly portrays or presupposes that the indigenous person is a docile and passive subject that can be easily converted, so to say. And this regards any theory of subjectivity, let me use that word, without any straight of subjectivity left before or after. Yeah, that's my comment. Or if you want to comment on that, that's
Sure.
and
No, I think what you're saying is actually very true. Yeah.
you actually have expounded a kind of theory of liberation, or so to say, kind of subjectivity. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
yes. If there is any question, now is the time for the discussion. I'll open it up. And if you have any question, please put on the chat box, or you can raise your hand and turn on your camera, or if you're not comfortable, then turn it off.
Hello, Dr. Longkumer. Thank you so much.
Yes.
This is a very new area for me. I'm sorry I'm not able to turn on my camera because, you know, online at home, and I'm not, appropriately ready for camera. However, this is this is an area that I'm very new to. So my question, I don't know, maybe it might sound very rudimentary for somebody who is an expertise, it's your area of expertise, but I wanted to ask a question that has been in my mind for some time, because when we talk about conversion, the coming of Christianity, and in the northeast tribal region, like whether it's Manipur, Mizoram, Nagaland, and then talk about the North Indian, well, the Adivasis, and there is this derogatory, we could call it a derogatory term that is often associated when I speak to Christians who are from other parts of India, like let's say Chhattisgarh, so they have been called rice bag converts,
Yeah.
because of certain incentives. But in the context of the Northeast India, the tribal belt, especially, the tribals, the STs, for lack of better way to explain it, constitutionally recognized as well. And you spoke about this disconnect. I wanted to ask you, like, do you think that there is a difference in the way Christianity was received by our forefathers, like let's say the first generation Christians in area like the Naga, the Mizo, the Ami belt, and whether it is different from how it was received in the north, in certain other parts of India, let's say not the northeastern but other parts of India, whether there's a difference in the way it was received. And my second question is, you talk about a certain disconnect. Most of what you're saying sort of went over my head. Like I said, it's a very new area for me. But my
Yeah.
second question is, when
Right.
you talk about this disconnect, do you think that this disconnect is especially in pertaining to our generation, like the second or the third generation Christians? Because from my own understanding, for the first generation Christian, my grandfather actually wrote a book, in the vernacular language um,
Mm.
how Christianity came about in our area. And based on my reading, the title of the book also talks about how uh, a lot of changes came about in terms of the it seems like the existence of the spiritual world was very real to them. It was
Mm.
something as real as the physical realm. So the coming of Christianity, the introduction of the name of Jesus, and how uh, that sort of introduced to them a power, that
Yeah.
does not seek to harm them, but save them, love them, protect them. It made a lot of sense to them. So can you please sort of from your
Yeah.
studies and elaborate a little bit on this? Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much for the question. I'll try to explain it in as simple language as possible so that you understand, right? So that this time will not go over your head. See, in terms of conversion or in terms of acceptance of Christianity, right? The first question is obviously, is there some kind of difference? And the simple answer is obviously yes. You know, um, when I was working on a PhD, one of the privilege I had was actually to attend this seminar. In this seminar, theologians from the so-called reputed theological institutions from India actually came together, and they were sitting together, and then they were actually trying to understand, okay, how do we do mission work in that sense, right? How do we continue to convert people in the context of India in that sense? And I was also invited to be part of that, and I sat and listened to all of them, and I that was such a profound experience for me in that sense, because one of the things that I was continually reading before that was how did these missionaries, the initial missionaries that came to, and specifically I was looking at Nagaland, right? Missionaries specifically came to Nagaland, did conversion in that sense, right? And here I'm sitting and listening to, in real time where people are actually really talking and discussing about how should we, bring this message to the people in today's context in that sense, right? That was something which I was looking at in that sense. And I mean, if you look at the history of how people have approached this idea or this aspect of conversion as such, right? Over the years, this has changed a lot in terms of the method that people have followed in this sense, right? But obviously, one thing that haven't changed is obviously that people do convert in this sense with whatever method that they follow in this sense. And so, I mean, theologically, when we think about this, right, of the idea of, because Christianity has this aspect of, okay, you being going and talking and converting people in the sense theologically has, theologically Christianity has this idea. And you will find that Christianity has actually done very well in terms, I mean, when you look at historically, right, in terms of conversion as such, it was not always through this idea of, oh, there is this God, or this idea of God is good, or there's this religion, this idea of religion is good, and all of those things. And there are different means to it in this sense, means through the means of power, or through the means of subjugation, or through different means in this sense. right? There are different means to this, in a sense. So that is where, when you look at Christianity, right, the so-called Christianity in the north, in the central part of India, and in the south, and all of those things, and also in the northeast and all. I mean, you see this. I mean, the way we are being Christian, in the sense, the way we think about our Christian faith and all of those things is very different, actually. So Christianity, in that sense, varies contextually a lot, right? And so this is where, when we think about the initial approach as such, the initial approach that any people or any missionaries or anything, anyone takes, is very much dependent on the method that they follow, in that sense. Also, obviously, there are a lot of difference, contextual difference in terms of conversion as such, right? Okay, obviously, we can go deeper into that, but I think the simple answer is yes, right? Another thing is, in terms of, as you have said, in terms of this disconnect, right? This is where I'm not talking about disconnect only in terms of the second generation or third generation as such, right? Let me expound on this disconnect a little bit further. And so let me bring in the example of the Ao Nagas, right? See, when the first person that E.W. Clerk could convert was Kodula. Kodula was an Assamese, right? And he became missionary, and he was actually the one who actually came to the Aos, the so-called Aos today, right? And he came to them, and then he was the one who actually kind of had the first connection or relation with the people, the so-called people, in that sense, right? In the writings, one of the things that you will see is that, people were actually mesmerized by his singing and prayers, right? The native people were actually mesmerized with his singing and prayers. And since obviously people, the native people themselves were actually very much fond of so-called merrymaking, in that sense. I mean, they actually grew fond of his singing and prayer during that time, right? And that is how they could actually form some kind of relation. I mean, Kudla could actually form some kind of relation with the people, the Aus. And that is how E.W. Crook could also actually come, in that sense, right? And one thing that you will see is that, when E.W. Clerk came to this first village, to this village, the so-called Ao Naga village, Longkumer, right? One of the things that, when the number of Christians were actually growing, in this sense, one of the things that they try to do is they actually try to have a place for themselves where they could actually come and pray and have fellowship together. And the villagers were actually very much mesmerized by this, but obviously the village leaders and all didn't like that, in the sense, what they were doing, in the sense, right? See, what I'm trying to point to you is that, okay, one of the first aspect of their relational connection with the people was obviously to this aspect of prayer and singing and all of those things. When you look at the context of Nagaland, right, you will see, three different phases. I mean, it's an arbitrary division. Obviously, it doesn't really follow strictly as such. But then the way how Christians would divide, the so-called wave of, revival is into three different phases, in the sense, right? Talk about this wave of revival, in the sense, right? And this power of revival as such. And obviously today the elderly people continue to talk about this, about revival, in that sense, how the revival fire was much more stronger during back that time, and now it's not so strong now, and all of those things. But one thing that is very much important here in terms of this aspect of the so-called disconnect, and this aspect of people converting, and people following some kind of beliefs and practices, is that again, initially, the native people were actually kind of, again, inspired by the missionaries, E.W. Clerk and all of those people, in that sense, right? But then again, today, we are continually influenced by many other different kinds of ideas, beliefs, and practices as such. And so this is where the so-called, their idea of belief, right, and those so-called, their theology, right, is something which is continually changing, right? One of the a scholar from Nagaland. His name is Kanado Chopi, which many of you might know. He actually calls this phenomena of change in, theology, change in the theology of the native people as Baptist 2.0. He used this word, right? Baptist 2.0. This is shift, some kind of change, a shift from the so-called the fire of revival to the another phase of doing theology as such, in that sense, right? So again, this is continually happening in this sense, right? The place where obviously disconnect happens, as I've told you, is where what the disconnect between what people express and what people practice in the sense, right? Obviously, as long as people practice something, it continually makes sense to them, right? And this is where I want to come to this idea of, this aspect of spirits being very much real and all of those things. And this is something which you will see among our people, right? There's this called so-called Ara sensor, like that. Is that these people are actually people who have some kind of visionary power, see visions and all of those things. And you know, these people, right, the idea of the so-called Ara sensor, remain in Christianity also in that sense, right? And in Christianity, this kind of people exist who see visions and all of those things. And this is something which is not a new idea that came from Christianity as such, because people, the pre-Christian people who were actually Ara sensor in that sense, right? They actually converted to Christianity in the sense. And why they converted to Christianity also because they believed that the spirits that they were communicating to in the sense, right? Or they were related to, they also converted to Christianity in the sense. So again, this idea of spiritual world being very real in that sense is something which comes from our pre-Christian belief and practice in this sense. It doesn't really come from Christianity per se as such in that sense. It actually comes from our rooted understanding of the world around us because it's, very much permeated by the so-called spirits as such in that sense, right? But then obviously there is a shift in our understanding of theology as such, continuous shift happening in that sense. It's not like one is better than other, but I think that is how, time kind of changes through different kind of influence in that sense, right? Yeah, so let me just keep it till there. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Even the spirits are converted, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's how they believed.
Over to you, Juan. Someone raised their
Hi, Tia. Am I audible?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to hear from you again. It's been a while. So I have two quick questions. I might, just pardon me if my voice is not audible. So first question, I really like that you brought in the question around animism and syncretism. Uh, Again, in this concern, I have the question around agency. So where does agency of the colonized subjects fit in if their reactions, class resistance, or whatever you want to call it, are in itself bounded by colonial structures, like following, for example, body politics of, right? So for our sort of coloniality of knowledge and body politics in itself sort of produce what we are at this moment or historically. So I'm trying to understand how you fit question of agency in sort of
Yeah.
in terms of the way we react to it, right? So I guess that do you want to call that agency because it is within that structure itself. So second question is more practical. Uh, because you're in the decolonial field, in terms of practice among the Nagas, like how do you profess sort of decolonial practice when it comes to religion or Christianity among the Nagas or Aos in particular? And how is that received by the Naga church or the Christian community? Thank you.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think let me try to talk about this idea of agency as such, right? In that sense, um, you know, one of the things that I have seen is this idea that you know when the colonial administrators came and the missionary came and when there's this process of converging happening and all, right? See, one of the thing that, and this is something which was really interesting to me also when I was working, that people who were converting, they actually thought that they are actually kind of going into, or trying to involve themselves in a phenomenon of some kind of change, in the sense, some kind of change that is coming to them or to their everyday life in that sense, right? And and this is this is an interesting aspect of, I mean, being human also, in that sense that change is something obviously that I mean, in many contexts, obviously change is something which we will resist as such, but also at the same time, people who were converting in that sense, they were actually seeing themselves as someone participating in some kind of positive change that was coming to them in that sense, right? And this is where, when they were actually, I mean, when they look at the so-called the colonial administrators or the missionaries and all of those things, they were seen as that agent of change, you know. And obviously, people who converted, for many of them in that sense, and for many of them, majority of them, they didn't see this change as something which is very bad as such. I mean, they saw this as something which is positive thing that was happening, right? But also at the same time, right, I would like to mention this thing, right, where, you know, when it comes to the idea of church, you know, this is where, when among the people that I worked on, right, they formed this village, the so-called village called Molong Yemsen. So when the initial conversion happened in Molong Kimo, right? So when the initial conversion was happening in Molong Kimo or such, E.W. Clark and the village heads and all, they had some kind of misunderstanding, you know. And it seemed like E.W. Clark was someone who was a very stubborn person and all of those things. But you know, that is how I read it in that sense, right? But I mean, we cannot really ascertain that in terms, I mean, concretely. But so E.W. Clark had this idea of forming a village, a place for the so-called Christian in that sense, right? And so this process of E.W. Clark moving from that village to another village in that sense, right, is where I actually talk about this in a heading called the re-engineering of the human individual, or the re-engineering of the native individual as such, because he wanted to re-engineer how these native people actually kind of understood themselves and the world around them in that sense, right? And this is something which I discuss a lot about that in that sense. He was trying to kind of rethink, re-engineer what a Christian individual and a Christian village would look like in the sense, right? And that is why he actually kind of went ahead and then with the Christians converted and then formed this new village called Molong Yimsen in that sense. And so this was a part of him, which was also saying, part of him, which was saying that, you know, obviously portraying his kind of agency, a legacy that he come from in that sense, right? That, okay, he come from a Christian culture, community, country, whatever in that sense, right? And that he wanted to, you know, have this village where that sense of his sense of belonging, or his sense of where he comes from, is being acted out in that sense. So, okay, that new village has been formed. Then after E.W. Clark, there were other missionaries who came. And when the other missionaries came, they were actually trying to, you know, dictate people, the native people. They were saying, oh, you can't do this, because E.W. Clark moved away for some time. So when the other missionaries came and all of those things, there was a clash between the missionaries and the villagers themselves in the Christian village, right? And so that was the thing that was happening. And so this villagers, this, you know, native people, the Ao Nagas, the Ao Naga Christians, they said, if you do all of those things, if you detect our faith, our belief practices, we will close the church. And the church there was closed for some time because of how the new missionary that came acted upon. Now, this is where you will see this thing happening, where again, the kind of shift in the sense of agency about being a Christian in that sense, right? Again, it's shifted to the native people in that sense, right? Again, so that is something that you will continually see of how, you know, the kind of push and pull that is happening in terms of the so-called agentic practice as such, in terms of how they understood themselves, their identity in that sense, right, and how it relates to the other in that sense, right, and that is something which you will continually see. But again, as I've said, you know, missionaries in that sense is always, or the so-called colonial administrators are always being considered as that beacon of change, of positive change in that sense, right? And people who were converting, they've always thought of themselves as being part of the positive change that was happening in the society in that sense, right? And that is where, you know, one of the things that you will see, one of the narrative that goes around today, even today, right, among the Ao Nagas is where, you know, these Ao Nagas will say, oh, you know, God, in the sense, this Christian God came first to us, in the sense, you know, they have a certain sense of proximity to God through this the so-called missionary who came in the sense, right? And because of the so-called missionary that came to us in the sense, and they only came specifically first to us in the sense, right? We have some kind of proximity towards this Christian God in that sense, right? And so they, talk about all of those aspect that is there. And so this is where you will see not only does an individual agency acting out, but there are multiple agencies that is either acting out in sync with each other or either clashes with each other in that sense, right? So that is one of the aspects that you will continue to see in that sense, right? And this is something which we can actually continue to explore. I think there is no hard, fast, conclusive answer to this, right? Another thing is obviously how is my voice being accepted and all of those things, and I think this is something. These discussions and all are something which is yet to be, deeply held in a theological circle. And so these are some things which, in the Christian community or theological circle among our people, at least to the so-called my people in that sense, right, is yet to be had, this kind of discussion, yet to be understood by the theologians as such. So again, it has not really seeped very deep down into the community, the theology community or people as such in that sense. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in this area. Thank you. Yeah.
It seems like we have one more coming. This will be the last. Keep it
Yeah.
concise, as this is you have already it's 9:30. Monte, over to you then.
Okay, thank you. Hi, brother. It's nice listening
Hi.
to you.
Thank you.
I have one very quick question. That is, we are no longer practicing our indigenous religion, like maybe animism, or whatever we may call it differently, depending upon the groups, ethnic groups, or whatever. So, like,
Yes.
since we didn't practice, we no longer practice our traditional religion. So, do you think this is a loss, or like, I really want to know what is your thoughts on this? Is it converting to Christianity is something that is harming us in a different way? मतलब, we are losing our this cultural identity somehow. But then Christian perspective, of course, is very good, very enlightening. There are many good things out there, of course. Um, so we are not really maintaining or keeping our indigenous identity in this case. So I want to know on your thoughts on this one. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think this is something which obviously I've also personally thought a lot about in that sense. I mean, see, all in all, when you think about Christianity as such, right? I mean, I'm sure many of you here will also agree. It has done a lot of positive things in this sense, for sure. But also at the same time, it has actually kind of, really taken us away from our roots, let's say, right? From our roots in terms of who we are, where we come from in that sense, right? And this is a very important thing in that sense, because when Christianity first came to the Ao Nagas, right, and when people got converted and when Christianity became popular, right, one of the first debate that happened, one of the first thing that people who were majority were Christians in the sense, right, took over was this thing of the narrative of our origin in the sense, right? Again, each one of us, all of our community has our origin story in the sense, right? Of where did we come from in that sense. Among our Nagas, similarly, we also have our origin story, right? And our origin story goes back to this certain village where there is some kind of rock, put in some kind of order, and we believe that we emerged from there. In my, when we were kids, my father used to tell us, we come from rocks and stones, right? I mean, literally talking about us, our origin in the sense, right? And I mean, if you ask to anyone today as to what does it mean to actually come from the land in that sense, right? To really come from the land, we do not really know as to what does it really entail in that sense, right? And this is something which I try to, and I do not try to, discuss it in terms of a concrete sense, but I try to discuss this philosophically in my work as to what does our origin story entail, right? In that sense, this is something which I discuss in my thesis. You can actually go and have a look at it in that sense, right? And I discuss this philosophically. Why? Because our origin story, right? It's very much politicized in that sense, and again because of the coming of Christianity in that sense, right? Coming of Christianity in that sense, and we have lost the meaning of what does it really mean to actually come and emerge from those things in that sense. And so it has actually really very much detached ourselves. For example, you might have also heard of this scholar by the name Doli Kukon and Arkadong Longkumer. And these two scholars are trying to bring the remnants of the so-called our forefathers from the, from the Oxford University Museum, right? They're trying to bring back those things. And there are, skeletons that are the skin of people and all of those things that are there. But then the thing is, see, those people who died during that time, the scars, the skin, and all of those things which were taken to that place during the time, when they are brought back in that sense, the question is, okay, will we give a Christian ritual to that? Or will we give the so-called the pre-Christian ritual that we have had? But obviously, if you want to give the pre-Christian ritual and to actually respect, their death, in terms of respecting them as we do not have anyone who can do that in that sense today. So I mean, we are trying to fight for bringing it back, but we cannot respect it in terms of the respect that we have to give to them in that sense, right? And so this is something which all of us as scholars today here, sitting here, I think this is something which we really need to think deep about in the sense of trying to maintain the sense of identity. Obviously, all of those political aspects that they are fine, that is still fine, but then I think we can actually, through our works, through the things that we do, small things that we do, we can actually maintain our roots on where we come from, who we are in that sense, right? And actually, in simple language and simple way, at least we can actually talk about these things to people and sensitize people about this. And these are something which is very important. So yes, Christianity has done a lot of good things, but it has detached ourselves from who we actually are in that sense, right? And one thing that if you want to be radical Christian in that sense, one thing that you can do is obviously to blend in our pre-Christian understanding of the world and Christianity together. And I don't know, you might be ostracized from the church, but if that is something which you want to do, then yeah, it will be interesting. But yeah, thank you all very much. Yeah.
Thank you for the enlightening and thoughtful discussion and also fun, Dr. Tia, and for the engaging Q&As also. We look forward to hearing from you, I guess, next time. And close this session now. Bye-bye.
Yes. Thank you all very much. Yeah, we'll catch up again. Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you.
Yeah, bye. Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much. Yeah.